Today I'm going to tell you a story so bold it shocked an entire frontier town, set in the snow-covered wilderness of the American West, where every glance is judged and every secret can get you killed. It's a land where a strong-willed woman and an Apache outsider cross paths in a way neither of them can escape. It all started with one quiet act of kindness, small enough to seem harmless, but powerful enough to ignite a love that defied the whole territory. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Territory of New Mexico, 1870. A bitter wind tore through the pines around Mara Ellridge's cabin, carrying the sharp sting of early winter. She stood on the porch, fingers clenched around the worn stock of her father's old shotgun, watching as Tael split firewood with clean, powerful swings. His bronze skin glistened with sweat despite the cold, and Mara forced her gaze away. "A storm's coming," she said, more to break the silence than to tell him something he already sensed. She had always been keen about the weather, keener than most. Tael paused with the axe held mid-air and studied the darkening sky. 3 days. Heavy snow. His English was smooth and precise, though he rarely wasted words. Everything he said felt deliberate, as carefully measured as every movement he made. Mara nodded, grateful for the simplicity of it. These were the kinds of talks she could handle. Weather, work, supplies, safe subjects that kept more dangerous thoughts at bay. "We should bring in more firewood," she said, already stepping toward the stacked logs. "I'll do it." Tael set the axe aside and moved to stop her, his fingers brushing her sleeve. The touch, innocent as it was, made Mara go still. 5 months since her parents had died. 4 months alone in this cabin with only Tael for company. 4 months of pretending she didn't notice the way his dark eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. "I'm not helpless," she said, sharper than she meant to be. "My father taught me how to survive in these mountains." "I know." There was no offense in his voice, only that steady calm. "You're stronger than most men I've met." The unexpected praise caught her off guard. She was used to the looks she got in town when she rode in for supplies. A woman alone, living in the wilderness with an Apache man. The whispers followed her everywhere. "She'll end up with her throat cut. That savage is just waiting his chance." The Ellridge girl gone wild. If only they knew how wrong they were. Tael had done nothing but show respect since Garrick Ellridge had hired him the year before. Even now, with no one watching but the mountains, he kept a careful distance. "We should check the smokehouse too," Mara said, shifting the subject. "Make sure everything's secure before the storm." Tael nodded and gathered an armful of split logs. Mara watched the smooth economy of his movements, the quiet power in his hands. Her father used to say Tael was worth 3 ordinary men on the land. Garrick Ellridge had never been like other settlers. He'd fought alongside Apaches during the Mexican-American War and held none of the usual prejudices. "Judge a man by his actions," he always told her, "not by the stories people tell about his kind." Those words were one of the many lessons Mara clung to now that he was gone. The autumn fever had taken both her parents within a single week. One moment she had been the sheltered daughter of a respected family. The next, she was alone with nothing but a remote cabin and 40 acres of rugged mountain land. At 23, she was already considered past her prime for marriage, and the few offers that came after her parents' deaths were nothing more than thinly veiled attempts to take her property. So she sent every suitor away and shocked the town by declaring she would run the homestead herself. No one had been more surprised than the townsfolk, but not her. The memory of her last trip into town still burned. It had been 6 weeks earlier, before the first frost. She'd ridden in with a careful list and counted every coin twice. Most of it had vanished with her parents' funeral. At the general store, Bryce Calderon had greeted her with stiff politeness, his eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting someone else to follow her in. "All alone today, Miss Ellridge?" he asked, sounding concerned while his gaze betrayed curiosity. "Yes," she replied, handing him her list. She'd learned it was best to say as little as possible. As Bryce gathered her supplies, Veda Lark and her daughter Elsie stepped inside, their conversation dying the moment they saw her. "Why, Miss Ellridge," Veda exclaimed with exaggerated surprise, "how brave of you to come all this way by yourself." Mara only nodded. She knew what was coming next. "I heard Corvin Strake offered to buy your land," Veda went on, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "Quite generous of him, given the circumstances." "Mr. Strake's offer didn't interest me," Mara replied evenly. Veda clicked her tongue. "A woman alone can't manage 40 acres, especially up in those mountains, and winter's coming." She shook her head with false concern. "Not to mention keeping that Indian around, it isn't proper." "He worked for my father," Mara said. "But your father was there," Veda insisted, her meaning clear. Her meaning was clear as glass. "You need to think about your reputation, dear. Folks are talking." "Let 'em," Mara Ellridge had said, snatching her parcels from Bryce Calderon and tucking them into her satchel. "Good day, Mrs. Lark." She'd felt their stares clawing at her back as she stepped out of the store, and heard the whispers kick up the moment the door creaked shut behind her. It was the same song everywhere she went. At the doctor's, the post office, even church, where Reverend Silrin Mott had pulled her aside after Sunday service, eyes full of pity, voice thick with judgment, worried for her soul. Only the blacksmiths had felt safe. Halden Pike had known her father for 2 decades and respected the man deeply. "Don't go letting gossip gnaw at you," he'd said while inspecting her mare's shoe. "Your pa knew what he was doing when he hired that Apache. I seen him around town. Quiet sort, but honest eyes. Trust your gut, girl, just like your pa taught you." That sliver of understanding had carried her through the long ride home, back to the ridge, where Tael had been waiting outside the cabin, already lifting her supplies off the horse without being told. Now, walking behind him towards the smokehouse, Mara felt that same quiet gratitude swell in her chest. Inside the small wooden shed, the air was thick with the scent of hickory and meat. Strips of venison dangled from hooks overhead, Tael's skill with the bow evident, as did the plucked remains of a wild turkey. It wasn't much, but it was something to get them through the storm rolling in. "We'll need more," she murmured, eyeing the supplies. "I'll go hunting tomorrow before the snow hits. I'll go with you." Her decision was firm. It wasn't just about meat. She needed the woods, the open air, one last time before winter trapped them inside. He studied her for a beat, then nodded. "At first light." As dusk crept in, Mara stepped back inside to fix supper. The cabin was modest but solid. 2 rooms down, a loft above. Her father, Garrick Ellridge, had built it with his bare hands 15 years ago when he first staked this land. Every beam and nail told a story of grit and love for this wild, untamed place. She stirred the beans bubbling over the hearth and tossed in the last sprigs of fresh herbs from her garden. Soon, all that remained would be what they'd dried, smoked, or shot. Once the snow fell, they'd be truly alone. When Tael stepped inside, he brought with him the scent of pine and chill. Without a word, he filled the basin and washed up. Little gestures like that were just part of him, a man who noticed things, who acted without needing to be asked. "Marshal Holt rode by while you were inside," he said, drying his hands with a worn scrap of cloth. Mara stiffened. "What did he want?" "To warn you." His voice stayed calm, unreadable. "Said there've been raids by some northern tribes. Claimed you might be planning to ride out and join them." She scoffed, bitterness sharp in her voice. Tael's jaw tightened just slightly. Said you'd be safer in town for the winter. This is my home. Mara slammed 2 plates onto the table. I'm not running just 'cause he's scared, or anyone else is. Tael sat across from her. In the flicker of the oil lamp, his face seemed carved from stone, strong, weathered but shadowed. The Apache. They aren't my tribe anymore, but they're still my people. If my staying here puts you in danger, don't. Her voice was low, cutting him off. You work for me now. My father trusted you. And so do I. She dished up the food without looking at him. Besides, she added, quieter now, you're the only reason I've managed to hold this place together. It was the closest she'd come to admitting she needed him, and the vulnerability of it burned. They ate in silence. But it wasn't a strained one. Over the months, they'd found a rhythm, unspoken, yet somehow intimate. Then, suddenly, Mara broke it. My father used to talk about you, she said, almost surprising herself. Said you saved his life during the war. Tael looked up, something shifting in his eyes. He saved mine first, he said simply. It was fair trade. He never told me that part, she said, curiosity tugging at her. What happened? Tael set down his fork and paused. Near Santa Fe, he said at last. I was scouting for the American army. My people had sided with them, after years of Mexican raids on our villages. His voice grew quieter, heavier. I got captured. The Mexicans planned to hang me as a spy. Your father was a lieutenant. He led a small rescue party, got me out. He paused. The fire popped. 2 weeks later, his unit walked into an ambush. I found them, warned them in time. He looked her in the eyes. That's when he said we were even. Mara smiled faintly. That sounds like my father. He always believed in debts settled, and promises kept. He was a good man, Mara said quietly. One of the few white men who saw me as a man, not just an Indian. Is that why you took the job? She asked, meeting his gaze. Because of what happened during the war? Tael thought a moment. That's part of it. But mostly, I had nowhere else to go. He looked her square in the eyes. My people, some of them call me between worlds man. Too much schooling for the tribe, too much Indian for the whites. Your father offered me a place where none of that mattered. The honesty in his words stirred something deep in Mara. It was the most personal thing he'd ever shared. A rare look past the guarded walls he always kept up. Well, it doesn't matter here either, she told him, her voice firm. Not to me. Something in Tael's expression eased, just slightly. A warmth flickered there. It made Mara's chest tighten, her pulse quicken. But he only gave a quiet nod and went back to his plate. After supper, he rose. I'll check on the animals before turning in. Mara nodded, watching him grab his coat and step into the twilight. The cabin creaked with the wind, and once the door shut behind him, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her shoulders sagged. Her careful composure cracked. She should send him away. That's what any proper woman would do. No one respectable would keep an unmarried Apache man on her property. But the thought of waking each morning to silence, without his quiet strength nearby, scared her more than the gossip ever could. That night, as wind whispered through the chinks in the log walls, Mara lay still beneath her quilt. She heard his footsteps on the porch below. He never entered the cabin. He always slept out in the tack room by the barn. But he walked the perimeter, watched over her. Every single night. She pulled the covers tighter and told herself the feeling warming her chest was nothing more than gratitude. Nothing more. Nothing dangerous. The storm came just like she said it would. 3 days later, roaring like a devil out of hell, Wind slammed into the walls hard enough to rattle the timbers, and snow piled halfway up the lower windows. For 2 whole days, the world was nothing but white and gray. Sky and ground blurred together in the fury. By the 3rd morning, the wind died. Silence returned. Mara woke with a start and dressed fast, the cold biting her skin even through her wool layers. When she opened the cabin door, she found Tael already outside, knee-deep in snow, clearing a path with a shovel. "Morning?" she called. Her breath curled like smoke in the frigid air. He paused and glanced back, leaning on the handle. Something in his look made her suddenly self-conscious. Hair hastily pinned, her mother's old shawl tight around her shoulders. "You should stay in. It's freezing," he said. "I've got to help with the stock," she countered, yanking her father's old coat around her. It hung big on her frame but offered real warmth. Tael shook his head slightly, but didn't argue. He knew better. Their last hunt before the storm had gone well. 2 rabbits and a small deer. Enough to last a while if cured right. Mara had helped him dress the carcasses with steady hands, not a hint of hesitation. She'd grown up watching her father do it. No use being squeamish out here. Now they worked in silence in the barn, breath steaming as they fed the milk cows, horses, and the few hens that survived the freeze. It was simple, necessary work, and something about it settled the soul. "We lost one," Tael said, holding out a frozen hen. Mara let out a tired sigh. "That's the 3rd this winter." Their gloved fingers brushed as she took it. "At least it won't go to waste. Stew tonight." She turned, then paused. Something on the back wall caught her eye. A small bundle tied to a nail. Feathers, beads, strange symbols painted in muted earth tones. "What's that?" she asked, though she already knew it hadn't been there yesterday. Tael followed her eyes, face unreadable. "Medicine bundle, for protection." "Protection from what?" He met her gaze. "Spirits in the storm." Mara blinked. He'd never spoken of such things before. Her folks had raised her Christian, but they weren't strict. Her father used to say, "God speaks to every soul in a different tongue." "Do you really believe in that?" she asked carefully. "Spirits in the snow?" A flicker moved in his dark eyes. "I believe in showing respect to things I don't understand." It was a diplomatic answer. But Mara wanted more. She looked back at the bundle. "Would you tell me about it, if it's not too personal?" He studied her face a long moment, as if trying to detect mockery. Finding none, he stepped beside her. His fingers lightly traced the feathers. "This one, eagle, for strength, wisdom. Owl, for seeing through darkness. Red moonlight, white silence. The red paint's sacred," Tael said, his voice lowering with quiet reverence. "It's made from earth my grandmother taught me to find. She was a medicine woman." Mara Ellridge leaned in closer, eyes tracing the faded crimson symbols painted on the wooden beam. "And the markings?" she asked, genuinely curious. "This one," he said, running a calloused finger over a swirling shape, "means protection." He moved to the next. "This one calls the spirits of the ancestors, and this," he paused over a jagged line, "asks for harmony between all things." Mara smiled softly. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Thank you for showing me." For a breath of a moment, something passed between them, unguarded and deeply human. No barriers, no fear, just warmth, but just as quickly, Tael stepped back, the weight of years returning to his stance. "The path to the woodshed needs clearing," he said, his voice clipped once more. "I'll handle it." "I'll help," Mara replied, already moving after him into the whitewashed world outside. They worked side by side through the morning, clearing paths to the barn, the coop, and the shed. The storm had blanketed everything in silence and frost, but with each stroke of the shovel, they reclaimed a little piece of their world. When the sun broke through, even briefly, the snow shimmered like scattered diamonds. Breathless, Mara paused, gazing out at the hushed land. "I've never seen it like this," she whispered. "So still, so white." Tael followed her eyes towards the valley, where the trees stood cloaked in silver. "The Apache call this ghost moon time," he said quietly, "when the world sleeps beneath the white blanket." "Ghost moon time," she repeated. "That's perfect." A rare smile tugged at the corners of Tael's mouth. Fleeting, like a wisp of smoke, but real. Mara saw it, and in that moment it warmed her more than the fire ever could. By midday, they'd cleared every needed path and checked on the animals again. The cold only deepened as the sun climbed higher, the air crisp enough to bite. As they made their way back to the cabin, Mara spoke softly. "My father said you fought with him in the war. That's how you learned English so well." Tael's expression tightened, but he gave a small nod. "Your father was a good man, treated me with respect, when others didn't." She hesitated, then asked, "Where were you before this? I mean, before you came to the homestead?" She'd wondered for weeks. Tael was too educated, too skilled to be just a farmhand. He didn't belong to this life. And yet, here he was. "Many places," he said, his voice distant. His gaze drifted to the snow-blown barn. "I scouted for the army for a while, worked on ranches, trapped in the mountains." "But you never stayed anywhere long." A shrug. "I wasn't welcome to stay." The words were plain, but they carried stories he didn't share. And Mara felt it in her chest, the ache of being the outsider. She knew what that felt like. The stares in town, the whispers in church pews. That poor Ellridge girl, gone strange since her folks passed. "Well," she said, voice firm, "you're welcome here, as long as you want to stay." Tael studied her for a long, unreadable moment. Whatever he saw in her eyes must have been enough, because he gave a single nod and said nothing more. That night, with the cold pressing in like claws, Mara sat at the hearth staring at the cot in the corner. It had been her father's, back when her mother was alive. After they'd passed, she couldn't bear the upstairs bedroom anymore. She stayed down here now, where the fire still spoke. She thought about Tael sleeping out in the storage shed. No insulation, no heat, not in this kind of cold. When he stepped in with the last bundle of firewood, she didn't wait. "It's too cold out there," she said in a rush. "You should sleep in here tonight, by the fire." He froze, eyes shifting from her to the cot. "I have blankets," he said carefully. "The storage room is enough." "It'll be 20 below tonight," she pressed. "You'll freeze out there." He didn't speak for a long while. Then finally, "I'll bring my bedroll. I can sleep on the floor." "The cot," she offered gently. "The floor," he repeated, quieter. And she understood. Even here, where no one could see or speak, lines still remained. She turned to the stove and busied herself with dinner. Tael stepped back out into the cold, returning minutes later with his bedroll, and something else. A small leather pouch. He set it gently on the table, and Mara couldn't help herself. "What's that?" Wordlessly, Tael opened the pouch and pulled out a tarnished silver pocket watch. He held it toward her. She hesitated, then took it. The metal was warm, like it had been held close. "It was your father's," Tael said quietly. "He gave it to me before he died." Told me to keep it safe until you were ready. Mara Ellridge studied the old pocket watch, her thumb tracing the scars in its silver. Why didn't you give this to me before? Tael hesitated. He made me swear to wait. Said you'd need time. His voice dropped, heavy with memory. He asked me to watch over you, to stay until you no longer needed me. The truth struck Mara like a blow. All these months, she'd believed Tael stayed only out of respect for Garrick Ellridge, or because he had nowhere else to go. Knowing her father had arranged her protection with his dying breath brought tears to her eyes. He knew I wouldn't accept charity, she whispered, still staring at the watch. That's why he kept you on as a hired man instead of a guardian. Tael nodded once. Your father understood pride. The soft ticking filled the room, a sound she hadn't heard since Garrick's death. One last living link to the man who raised her to stand on her own. He spoke of you often in his final days, Tael said quietly. He was afraid of leaving you alone. I promised him I'd stay as long as needed. What were his last words? Mara asked, suddenly desperate. She had been away fetching medicine when Garrick passed. Tael's eyes softened. He said, Tell my daughter she's stronger than she knows. Tell her I'm proud of the woman she's become. The tears came before Mara could stop them. Tael turned his face away, giving her space. Thank you, she said at last, closing her fingers around the watch. And thank you for keeping your promise. I will keep it as long as it takes, Tael replied. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, fragile yet steady as a silver thread in the dark. That night, as ice glazed the inside of the windows, Mara lay awake listening to Tael's slow breathing from the floor. Firelight danced across the walls, and beyond them, the New Mexico wilderness lay silent under snow. For the first time since her parents died, the ache of loneliness began to ease, replaced by something she wasn't ready to name. January came down hard. The cold locked the world in ice, the sun a pale coin offering light but no warmth. Inside the cabin, Mara and Tael fell into a careful rhythm, sharing meals, dividing chores, living close while keeping the invisible lines of propriety intact. Tael slept on the floor each night, rising before dawn to feed the fire. Mara pretended not to notice the way his eyes lingered when she read by lamplight, or how his hand sometimes brushed too near when she passed him a cup. The days were long and quiet, filled with work but little else. To fill the evenings, Mara began reading aloud from her father's small library. Tael never commented, but she knew he listened. The way his hands would still gave him away. One night, snow whispered against the windows. Mara closed the book, a worn volume of her mother's Shakespeare. Did your people have stories? She asked. Tales passed down, like these? Tael looked up from the arrowhead he was shaping. Many. Our history lives in memory, not ink. Would you tell me one? She asked. He set his work aside. Some stories are sacred, but some are meant for teaching. He shifted closer to the fire. I can tell you how coyotes scattered the stars. Mara set her book aside, eager. Tael's voice took on a rhythmic, almost musical tone as he spoke of Coyote stealing a bag of stars and flinging them across the sky, creating the constellations. His hands moved with the story, and Mara found herself drawn not just to the tale, but to this softer, brighter side of him. When he finished, a warm silence settled between them. That was beautiful, Mara said. Thank you. My grandmother Yara told me that when I was small, Tael murmured. She knew hundreds of stories, of mountains, animals, the first people. When she died, many of those stories died with her. The loss in his voice made Mara's heart ache. "Tell me about her," she said gently. Tael was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. She was a small woman, but she carried the weight of generations in her bones. Her hands never stopped, always weaving baskets, grinding maize, or mixing herbs with quiet precision. She could read the wind better than any man, predicting storms just by the shift in scent or a whisper in the air. A trace of a smile crossed Tael's face. She had no tolerance for nonsense. Once, when I was 12 and thought I was a man, I went out hunting without permission. He gave a soft chuckle. Fell and broke my arm. She didn't scold me, just set the bone, silent as a shadow, then made me scrape hides for 3 weeks, with the broken arm and all. She sounds like a force of nature, Mara Ellridge said, grinning. What was her name? Naelin. It means breeze in our tongue. Tael's voice softened. She taught me to read white folks' books in secret, told me knowledge was sharper than any blade. She must have been remarkable, Mara said gently. She would have liked you, he said, almost too casually. But something in those words felt deeply sacred, as if he'd offered her a piece of himself. They kept talking. Mara shared memories of her grandmother, Hetty, who taught her how to quilt and bake bread from scratch. Tael described the deep reds of canyon walls and the starlit nights of his youth. For the first time, it wasn't employer and hired hand speaking. It was two people stitched together by grief and the memory of love. That night, a bitter wind howled through the eaves like a wounded animal. Mara sat by the fire, mending one of her father's old shirts, now stretched at the seams by Tael's broader frame. She pricked her finger hard on the needle. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as blood welled up. Before she could react, Tael was beside her, gently cradling her hand in his. "Let me see," he said, voice low and steady. His attention was fixed on her hand. But Mara, she was looking at him, the lines of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way the firelight flickered across his face. She stood abruptly, fetched a tin from his belongings, and returned. Inside was a green salve with a scent of pine and earth. "This'll keep it from festering," he said, smoothing it over her finger with unexpected tenderness. "Thank you," she murmured. Her own voice sounded strange to her. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked. "My grandmother was a healer," he replied. "Taught me everything, before the soldiers came." It was the most personal thing he'd ever said. Mara leaned in, gently. "What happened?" His almost smile faded. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't speak, but then, still holding her hand, he began. "I was 14, old enough to fight," my father said, but Naelin didn't agree. She hid me in the high caves with the little ones when the bluecoats rode in. His voice was steady, but Mara felt his grip tighten slightly. "When I came back, there was no one. Nothing." Her throat clenched. "Your family?" "All gone." He stood slowly. "That's when I started learning English. Figured if my world was burned, I'd survive in theirs." "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words felt hollow. She moved to the hearth, tossing in another log. Firelight carved deep shadows across his face. "That's why you left your people?" she asked. "Because it hurt too much to stay?" He looked at her, surprised. "You don't shy away from hard questions. You don't have to answer." "No." He stepped closer, brushing a hand through hair that had grown longer under her father's roof. "I left because I no longer belonged, spoke too much English, knew too much of their world. The elders said I'd lost my spirit." "Do you think that's true?" she asked. He met her gaze. "Sometimes, but not here." "Here." "Here. I remember who I am." There was a weight behind his words, like a current pulling her under. Her heart stammered. "And who are you, Tael?" He didn't answer at once. Instead, he moved closer, kneeling before her, eyes level with hers, the fire casting him in gold and shadow. "I'm someone who's seen your grief," he said softly. "Someone who's watched your strength, your courage, and someone who sees you, Mara Ellridge." The way he said her name, it was unlike anything she'd heard before. Like it meant something sacred. The way her name sounded in his voice sent a quiet shiver through Mara Ellridge's spine. She opened her mouth. But the rest caught in her throat. What could she possibly say that wouldn't tear apart the fragile boundary they'd both been so careful not to cross? A log in the hearth shifted, bursting sparks into the air, and the flare of orange firelight seemed to snap the spell between them. Tael stepped back. "It's late," he said, his voice low. "You should rest." Mara gave a slight nod, thankful for the space, but strangely disappointed. She gathered her mending and moved toward the ladder, leading to the loft where she'd begun sleeping again since he'd taken to the cot downstairs. At the base of the ladder, she hesitated. "Tael?" He looked up from the floor where he was laying out his bedroll near the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for sharing what you did, and for seeing me." Something flickered behind his eyes then. Something tender, glowing softly in the fire's reflection. "Sleep well, Mara." Later that night, buried under thick quilts in the dark hush of the loft, Mara stared into nothing and let herself finally admit what she'd been burying for months. The way her heart fluttered when he spoke her name. The way his presence ignited something deep in her bones. It wasn't just gratitude, and it wasn't dependency either. It was longing. Desire. The word should have filled her with shame. But instead, it nestled into her chest like it had always belonged there. Like her heart had just been waiting for her mind to catch up. Outside, the wind mourned low across the eaves. Inside, her pulse beat to a rhythm she could no longer ignore. Morning broke clear and bone cold, the storm having spent its fury in the night. Sunlight sparkled over the snow like crushed crystal, and for the first time in weeks, a sense of hope stirred in Mara's chest. Maybe, just maybe, they could finally make it into town. When she climbed down from the loft, Tael was already dressed in his heavy coat, pulling on thick gloves. "I'm heading out to check the trail," he said, nodding towards the window. "Might be we can get a wagon through." "I'll come with you," Mara said, grabbing her coat and following him out into the dazzling white. They walked the buried road, side by side, boots crunching in the silence. Some places the drifts reached their knees. Others, the wind had swept it clean down to frozen dirt. After about half a mile, Mara squinted toward the ridge. "Might be passable. Not for the wagon, but with the horses. We could take the pack horse, bring back what we need." She brushed snow from her gloves. "We're near out of flour and coffee, and I should check for mail. My aunt might have written from Santa Fe." They turned back toward the cabin, steps in rhythm, breath rising in clouds. The quiet between them held something new now. No longer comfort, but tension, charged and electric. "About last night," Mara began, the open sky lending her courage. "You don't have to say anything," Tael replied softly. "I do." She stopped walking. He halted, too. "What you said, about seeing me. I want you to know. I see you too." The words hung between them, vulnerable in the frosty air. Tael's face remained unreadable, but his eyes kindled with something deep. "Mara." Her name held weight, a warning, a plea, maybe a promise. "I know it's not easy," she rushed on. "I know what folks in town would say. Hell, I know what they already whisper. But out here, in these mountains, with no one judging but ourselves, she faltered, heart hammering. I just don't want to pretend anymore. She met his eyes, steady, unwavering. I don't want to ignore what's happening between us. Tael didn't move at first. Then slowly, he raised a gloved hand to her cheek. His fingers brushed along her skin like she was made of something sacred. There's no turning back if we cross this line, he said gently. Are you sure? Instead of answering with words, Mara stepped forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss began tentative, then deepened, wild and breathless. He pulled her into his arms like he'd been waiting a lifetime. When they finally came apart, chests heaving, he leaned his forehead against hers. We should head back, he whispered. The walk home was a blur. Inside the cabin, with the door shut tight against the world, they reached for each other again. No more hesitating, no more lies. Tael's hands were strong but gentle as he peeled away her layers, his lips warm and reverent. Mara trembled, not from cold, but from something far older than fear, from knowing this was right. I've wanted this since summer, he murmured against her skin. Watching you in the garden, so fierce, so beautiful. Why didn't you say anything? She whispered, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw. It wasn't my right, his voice low, eyes locked on hers. And I was scared you'd turn me away. Never, Mara Ellridge whispered back. I need you more than I've ever needed anything. They moved toward the bed, her bed now, hauled down from the loft just last week when the cold had turned bitter. And there, in the tender hush of a winter morning, they found each other completely. Tael's body was lean, powerful, etched with scars that whispered of a life carved in hardship. Hers, softer by nature, held the quiet strength forged through months of toil and grit. Afterward, nestled in the warmth of his arms, Mara felt no guilt, no second thoughts, just a deep, anchoring peace, as if some part of her soul that had wandered lost had finally come home. What happens now? She murmured, her fingers drawing lazy shapes across his chest. Tael's hand combed gently through her loose hair. Now we live, he said. One day at a time. It sounded simple when he said it, but Mara knew better. Life outside their cabin would never be simple. Not for them. For now, they were safe, wrapped in the silence of winter. But come spring, folks would start showing up. The world would start asking questions. Still, in the cocoon of their small cabin, with sunlight spilling through frost-laced windows, none of that mattered. Just the sound of Tael's breathing, his heartbeat beneath her palm, the unspoken vow that they'd face whatever came. Together. In the days that followed, they slipped into a new rhythm. Chores still filled their daylight hours, but now there were subtle glances, hands brushing hands, smiles that lingered. Nights brought a different kind of warmth, no longer separated by walls or fear, but drawn close under the same blanket. Mara found herself humming at the stove, her step lighter. Even Tael seemed changed. Some weight he carried had lifted, replaced by something like joy. Their trip to town had to wait nearly a week, snow still thick in the shaded places. When they finally rode out, astride the sure-footed horses that had seen them through many winters, Mara felt a nervous flutter in her gut. We don't have to ride in together, Tael said, reading her face. I can wait by the edge. No, Mara answered, her voice firm. I won't pretend we're not what we are. But even as she said it, she knew there'd be limits. In town, they'd still need to play their parts, for safety, for peace. Tael nodded once, understanding her without her needing to explain. I'll follow your lead, Dust and snow mixed into slush along the main street. Wooden buildings hunched under smoke from chimneys. As they rode into town, Mara could feel the hush of eyes turning their way. The brief pause in conversation. The weight of judgment. She straightened in her saddle, lifted her chin the way her father, Mara Ellridge, once had when folks dared question his choices. Beside her, Tael's face gave nothing away. Calm and unreadable. Their first stop was the general store. Bryce Calderon greeted them with his usual stiff smile. Mara handed over her list of supplies, while Tael stood near the door, hat in hand, the picture of a quiet ranch hand. "Hell of a storm," Bryce muttered, bagging her goods. "Must have been rough up on that mountain." "We managed," she said evenly. "Sheriff Holt was worried. Said he offered to escort you down before the weather turned, but you declined." "I'm more than capable of taking care of myself, Mr. Calderon," Mara replied, polite but firm. "And Tael's been a damn good help. We had everything we needed." Bryce made a noise that said neither agreement nor challenge, and kept filling her order. The bell above the door jingled. Mara turned to see Veda Lark step in, her daughter Elsie close behind. And with them, Corvin Strake. "Why, Miss Ellridge?" Veda trilled, her voice full of feigned delight. "So good to see you made it through the blizzard. We were all just so concerned." "Appreciate the worry, Mrs. Lark," Mara replied coolly. "As you can see, we're just fine." Corvin Strake stepped forward then, tall frame cutting off the light from the window. He was handsome, in a polished, practiced way, success clinging to him like cologne. But his eyes, they'd always unsettled Mara. Calculating. Cold. "Miss Ellridge," he said, touching his hat. "You're looking well, considering the long winter." His eyes flicked to Tael, narrowing slightly. "I see your hired help's still with you." Tael didn't flinch, didn't blink. Mara did it for him. "Yes, Mr. Strake," she said, voice edged with fire, "and I'm lucky to have someone I can trust." Then she turned back to Bryce, ending the conversation before it could turn to ash. "Will that be all, Mr. Calderon? We've got a few more stops before we head back up the mountain." Before Bryce Calderon could answer, Corvin Strake cut in smoothly. "Actually, Miss Ellridge, I was hoping to have a word with you. Alone." Mara Ellridge's stomach turned. She didn't want a damn thing to do with Corvin Strake, but making a scene would only feed the gossips. She glanced to Tael, who gave her the smallest of nods. "All right, Mr. Strake, but I've not got much time." They stepped out onto the store's front porch. The sun sat high in a pale blue sky, offering some warmth, but the air still held the bite of winter. "I'll be plain," Strake said, lowering his voice. "I'm still interested in your property. The offer I made after your father passed, still on the table. In fact, I'm willing to bump it up 20%. Mara blinked. It was more money than the land was rightly worth by any measure. "Why?" she asked flatly. "Why's my land so important to you?" Strake smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Let's say I've got plans. That creek of yours, it's worth its weight in gold. Water like that's power in this territory." Her jaw tightened. Her father had always said that spring-fed creek was the heart of their land. In dry times, it was a lifeline. "I'm not interested in selling," she said, steel in her voice. "Not at any price." His smile faltered. A shadow crossed his face. "Miss Ellridge, be reasonable. A woman alone can't manage 40 acres. Not out in those hills. It ain't safe. Ain't practical." "I'm managing just fine," she answered coolly. "For now," he allowed. Then leaned in, voice dropping. "But what happens when the money dries up? Or when that Apache of yours gets tired of playing the obedient helper?" He looked her square in the eye. "Folks talk, you know. Ain't exactly proper, you two living up there alone." A chill that had nothing to do with the wind ran down her spine. What exactly are you implying, Mr. Strake? Just that appearances matter in a town like ours, he said smoothly. Your daddy was respected, but that goodwill's got limits. Keep walking this path. Well, he let the sentence hang in the air like a noose. My choices are mine, Mara said sharply, her voice rising with fire. And I choose to keep my land. Strake's face hardened. Times are changing. Army's bringing in more troops to handle the Apache problem. Would be a shame if your hired hand got himself caught up in something ugly. The veiled threat made her blood run cold, but she held her ground, voice calm. Good day, Mr. Strake, she said, turning to head back inside. He caught her arm. Think it over, Miss Ellridge. That offer won't be open forever. She yanked her arm free and stared him down. Don't threaten me, Mr. Strake. My father taught me plenty, including how to shoot straight. With that, she walked back into the store, heart thundering like hooves on dry earth. As she stepped inside, her eyes found Tael's instantly. He searched her face. She gave a subtle shake of her head. Not now, not here. They finished their errands in silence, the air between them heavy. They picked up their mail at the post office, then stopped by the blacksmith to arrange spring repairs on the plow. All the while, Mara felt the stairs, heard the whispers trailing behind them. Only when they were far from town, the trail winding back toward their mountain home, did she speak. Strake made another offer, she said, and he didn't stop there. He talked about the army bringing in troops, said it'd be a shame if you got tangled in it. Tael's face didn't change, but his jaw tightened. I figured as much, he said. That creek on your land feeds the valley where his cattle graze. In a dry season, it could double his power. He wants the water. He threatened you, Mara said, her voice shaking now that the fear had caught up to her. He said it plain, and he's got a connection at Fort Craig. His brother-in-law's an officer. Tael kept his gaze forward, calm as stone. He won't act directly, not yet. Too much risk. But we need to stay alert. They rode in silence, each tangled in their own thoughts, the sun dipping lower behind the hills. Then Tael spoke again, his voice gentler. Mara, if you ever wanted to sell and start over somewhere else, I'd understand. She pulled her horse to a stop, turning to him, eyes flashing. Is that what you think? That I'd run? He hesitated. I think loving me will make your life harder. And easier than it would be without you, she snapped back, fire in her voice. This land is my home. This is our home, Mara Ellridge said, her voice low but fierce. I won't let Corvin Strake or anyone else drive us off this land. Tael looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not just pride, something deeper. Love, maybe, or a kind of reverence. Then we stay, he said simply, and we prepare. They rode on, the trail winding homeward as the sun dipped low behind the western ridge. The light turned golden, casting long shadows through the trees. Mara felt something stir in her chest. Not fear, not anymore, but a quiet, burning resolve. There would be storms. There would be men like Strake, hungry for land that didn't belong to them. But side by side, she and Tael could weather it. When their cabin came into view, tucked into the trees, smoke curling from the chimney, it felt like a fortress, carved from stubborn hope and worn timber. Home, Mara whispered. Tael nodded, eyes fixed on the same familiar shape through the trees. Home, he echoed. That single word was enough. A promise passed between them, unspoken but iron strong. Whatever came, slander, steel, or snow, they'd face it together. The change came slowly, with the melt of spring. The snow pulled back from the hills, revealing damp, hungry earth. The creeks roared to life, swollen with runoff. their murmur now a wild chorus rushing toward the valley. But it wasn't just the land that shifted. Inside the cabin, something else had taken root. That careful distance Mara and Tael had held between them, the hesitation, the unsure silences, was gone. What grew in its place was quiet and rare. They shared stories by lamplight, laughed over burned biscuits, and whispered dreams beneath the thick quilts at night. No more guessing, no more walls. Every moment in each other's arms felt like shelter, like something they hadn't known they needed until now. It was fragile, that happiness, built on solitude and stillness, but they both knew it wouldn't last untouched. And sure enough, the outside world came knocking sooner than they'd expected. It was early April. Green had just begun to sneak into the brown fields. Mara was in the garden, loosening soil with her hands, when movement caught her eye down the trail. "Riders coming," she called, shielding her brow from the sun. Tael was mending fence nearby. He straightened, quiet and still, his eyes narrowing. "3 of them," she added. Her gut turned as she recognized the lead rider. Sheriff Holt. Sheriff Dara Holt had made his feelings clear last time, hinting in no uncertain terms that a white woman living alone with an Apache was scandal enough to stir trouble. Mara stepped closer to Tael, brushing her fingers against his hand. One brief, defiant squeeze, then let go. "We knew this day would come," she said quietly, "but we've got nothing to be ashamed of." Tael gave no answer, but his gaze never left the riders. As they neared, Mara saw the others. One was Reverend Silrin Mott from the town chapel. The third, Corvin Strake. Her stomach knotted. "Miss Ellridge," Sheriff Holt called, tipping his hat as he reined in. "Glad to see you made it through the winter." "Sheriff," Mara nodded, cool and composed. She didn't bother greeting the others. "What brings you all the way up here?" The men dismounted. Mara noticed their eyes flick to Tael, who stood silent, posture relaxed but alert. "We came to check on you," Holt said, but his tone was tight. This wasn't a friendly call. "More trouble west of here. A few homesteads burned last month. Renegade Apaches, from what we hear." "Funny," Mara said, crossing her arms. "I hadn't heard a word." Reverend Mott stepped forward, voice solemn. "We're concerned for your safety, Miss Ellridge. Living out here, alone, with—" He let his sentence trail off, his gaze lingering on Tael. "I'm not alone," Mara said, her voice steady. "And Tael's worked this land going on 2 years. My father trusted him completely." Corvin Strake scoffed. "Your father was a decent man, but he had some unconventional ideas about Indians." He shrugged. "You may not understand the risks you're taking." Mara's chin lifted. "Oh, I understand just fine, Mr. Strake. What I don't understand is why 3 grown men are riding up my mountain with no business to speak of." Sheriff Holt glanced at the others. "Thing is, Miss Ellridge, there's been talk in town. Concerns about your arrangement." "My arrangement?" she echoed, her voice like flint. "A young woman, unmarried, living alone with a man?" Reverend Mott interjected. "Especially under these circumstances," Strake added, smoothly cutting in. "Your reputation's at risk, and that matters in a place like ours." Heat bloomed in Mara's cheeks, not from shame, but anger. "My reputation?" she snapped. "I didn't realize that was any of your business, Mr. Strake." To his credit, Strake shifted uneasily. "Your father and I did business together for years. I just feel a sense of duty." "Your only duty," Mara cut in, voice sharp as glass, "is to stay off my land and mind your own damn affairs." She stepped forward, eyes blazing. "Now, unless you've got real business with me, papers, warrants, something besides town gossip, I suggest you ride back the way you came." Sheriff Holt's expression darkened. "Miss Ellridge, we're trying to look out for you," Sheriff Dara Holt said firmly. "These attacks are real, and having an Apache living on your land might just put a target on your back." "Or maybe," Mara Ellridge countered, her voice steady as stone, "Tael's presence is the reason trouble hasn't found me yet. Ever consider that?" The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that makes a person hold their breath without realizing it. Then Tael spoke, his tone calm, deliberate. "Sheriff," he said, "I understand your concerns, but I've got no ties to the ones behind these attacks." He looked briefly at Mara before turning back to Holt. "My loyalty lies here. I'd give my life to defend this land, and the woman who keeps it." There was something in the way he said it, quiet, unwavering, that made even Holt falter. The sheriff gave a slow nod, but his voice still held tension. "Maybe that's true," he said, "but regardless of what you mean to do, your presence stirs the dust, makes things complicated." That's when Corvin Strake stepped closer to Mara, dropping his voice to something meant only for her. "I've still got that offer on your land," he said. "It's fair. You could come into town, stay with Tamsin Rowe a while, figure things out." Mara's jaw clenched as realization hit her like a strike of lightning. "So that's what this is really about?" she said. "Not my safety. My land." "That's not fair," Strake said quickly, but the red creeping up his neck told a different truth. "My father turned you down every time you came sniffing round," Mara went on, her words sharp and cold. "Did you think I'd be easier to scare off with whispered warnings about Apache raids?" Reverend Silren Mott lifted his hands in a peacekeeping gesture. "Miss Ellridge, no one is threatening you. We're genuinely concerned." "I think you all ought to leave," Mara said flatly, cutting him off. Her voice left no room for debate. For a moment, it looked like the sheriff might push back, but something in her eyes, or maybe Tael's silent presence standing tall behind her, made him think better of it. "Very well," Sheriff Holt said stiffly. "But I hope you'll think on what we said. The territory's changing fast. The army's sending in more men to deal with the Apache." He glanced sideways at Tael. "Be a shame if misunderstandings happened." The warning hung in the air like the smell of smoke before a fire. Mara didn't flinch. "Good day, gentlemen," she said, cold as iron. They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving only the dust of their passing. When they were nothing but specks down the trail, Mara finally let the tension drain from her shoulders. She stood beside Tael and whispered, "They'll be back." "I know," he said. She turned to him, searching his face. "What did he mean about more troops?" "There's a new commander at Fort Craig, General Brask Hollow," Tael said, his expression unreadable. "He's got a history with the Chiricahua, not a good one." Mara felt a chill, even in the warm spring air. "Are you in danger?" "We both are," Tael said softly. "What we are to each other, it threatens them." He was right. In the quiet months since they'd come together, they'd carved out a life of their own on the homestead, a fragile peace built on trust and love. But that peace stood in defiance of the world beyond. "I won't let them tear us apart," she said fiercely. "This land is mine. This life is mine." He reached up and touched her cheek, his hand gentle against her skin. "Still so brave, Mara Ellridge." "Not brave," she said, her voice low. "Just stubborn." He smiled faintly. That too. That night, as darkness wrapped the cabin, Mara could feel the tension in Tael's body. He lay beside her, unmoving, his breath too even, too controlled. "Tell me what's on your mind," she murmured, her hand finding his beneath the covers. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he turned to her, his face etched in moonlight. "I'm thinking maybe I should leave," he said. the words thick with sorrow. "Before I bring trouble to your doorstep." Mara sat up, heart pounding. "No, absolutely not." "Listen to me," he said, rising to sit beside her. "Marshall was right. I make you a target, not just from raids, but from men like Strake who want this land." "So I should just roll over and give up?" she asked, voice rising. "My father didn't raise me to back down." "This isn't about fighting," he said, taking her hands gently. "It's about survival." "My survival doesn't mean a damn thing without you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "These past few months, they've been the first time I've felt truly alive since my folks passed. Don't ask me to go back to just existing." She threw her arms around him, held on tight. And in the dark, wrapped in each other, neither of them spoke. But their hearts made a vow no lawman could break. She could feel the steady thrum of his heartbeat, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as they ran through her hair. "I love you," Tael whispered. The words barely broke the stillness, but they struck deeper than any thunder. It was the first time either had dared speak it aloud, though the feeling had been blooming between them like desert wildflowers after rain. He pulled back slightly, his eyes filled with pain. "That's why I can't stay. I can't be selfish. I won't bring danger to your door." Mara raised her head, her hands framing his face, firm and tender all at once. "Loving me isn't selfish," she said, her voice raw. "But leaving me would break me clean in two." She held his gaze. "We'll figure it out. We have to." Later that night, long after he'd drifted into sleep beside her, Mara lay awake, eyes wide open in the dark. She'd seen the danger in Sheriff Holt's stare, heard it behind Corvin Strake's civil words. Trouble was coming. But the idea of losing Tael, it wasn't something she could survive. Not again. There had to be a way, a solution that would allow them to stay together without having to glance over their shoulders for the rest of their lives. Her father, Mara Ellridge, had been a man of grit and foresight. Always said you didn't wait for the storm. You fortified your home, tightened your grip on what mattered most, and stared down the horizon. "When the sky turns dark, Katie girl, don't go hiding. You brace up and face it with both feet planted." What mattered now was Tael, the life they were building, the love they'd forged out of sweat, stubbornness, and firelight. But how to defend it? The answer came like a whisper at dawn. Marriage. It struck her like lightning, bold, reckless, maybe even scandalous, but it might be the only way to secure legal protection. A binding tie no outsider could ignore. Still, would any preacher in the territory be willing to wed a white woman to an Apache man? And would that shield them, or put an even bigger target on their backs? She didn't know, but for the first time in days, she felt something other than fear stirring in her chest. Hope. She would speak to Tael at first light. Together they'd find the courage not just to survive, but to build something worth living for. Morning came without answers, but not without change. Mara stepped onto the porch, warm mug in hand, just as a lone rider crested the ridge, moving slow and steady up the trail. She called out, "Tael!" He emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. She nodded toward the figure in the distance. "Do you recognize him?" He squinted toward the rider, shading his eyes. "Not Holt," he said. "Not the others either." They stood side by side, silent as the wind rustled the pines. As the rider neared, Mara caught sight of the blue of an army coat. An officer's insignia gleamed on his shoulders. "What's the army want with us?" she muttered, a chill running up her spine. "Wait here," Tael said, moving toward the rider. But Mara followed a few steps behind, unwilling to let him face whoever this was alone. The officer pulled his horse to a stop, and dismounted in one smooth motion. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with a short, trimmed beard and sharp, observant eyes. He took off his hat. "Miss Ellridge?" She nodded. "That's right. Captain Axton Reed, Fort Craig." "What brings you all the way up here, Captain?" she asked, noticing how Tael subtly stepped between them. Reed's gaze landed on Tael, and something like recognition sparked in his eyes. "Tael, isn't it? You rode as a scout for Lieutenant Jory Flint couple years back?" Tael gave a tight nod. "I did." "You were one of the good ones," Reed said plainly. "Flint always said you saw clearer than most." He turned his attention back to Mara. "Miss Ellridge, I've come with news. Best we speak inside." She hesitated but stepped aside to let him in. Whatever he had to say, better it be said behind walls than out in the open. Inside, Reed declined the coffee but sat at the small table. Tael stayed on his feet, leaning quietly against the wall, eyes never leaving the soldier. Reed set his hat down and got straight to it. "Sheriff Holt rode to the fort yesterday. Talked about Apache trouble in these parts. He hinted that certain folks might be leaking information to the hostiles." Mara's lips tightened. "By certain folks, you mean Tael." Reed didn't deny it. "That was the implication." "He's wrong," she said, "and it's none of his damn business." Reed raised a hand gently. "I'm not here to meddle, quite the opposite." He looked at Tael now. "I've worked with scouts a long time. The good ones walk a line between two worlds. It's not easy. Not many have the courage for it." Tael said nothing at first, but Mara could feel the shift in his breath. Like her words had caught him off guard. This wasn't the kind of talk either of them had expected from a man in uniform. Captain Axton Reed leaned forward, his tone steady. "General Brask Hollows ordered heavier patrols. After the recent attacks, tensions are rising." He paused. "Some officers don't know the difference between a peaceful Apache and a raider, and worse, they don't care." "You're warning us," Mara said, the truth dawning like cold wind on bare skin. Reed nodded. "Sheriff Dara Holt and a few local ranchers, Corvin Strake especially, are calling for action. They want any Apache caught off reservation dealt with." "Why tell us?" Tael asked finally, his voice quiet but firm. Reed's face softened. "Because my wife's Navajo, and I know what it means to walk that line. I also knew your father, Miss Ellridge. Garrick was a good man, fair, decent. He judged by heart, not blood. I respected him for that." The admission left Mara speechless. This soldier, an officer of the U.S. Army, had come all this way not with threats, but with warning. Not for duty's sake, but out of a shared understanding and respect. She swallowed. "What do you think we should do?" Reed sighed. "Wish I had a clear answer. The territory's shifting. The railroad's pushing through the valley next year. More settlers, more eyes. The way folks used to live, quiet, out of sight, it's disappearing." He looked her straight on. "It's getting harder to be left alone." "We're not leaving," Mara said, her voice like steel. "This land's ours." The captain studied her for a long moment. Then something behind his eyes settled. "There might be a way," he said slowly, "to protect what you've built. Legally." Her brows lifted. "How?" "Marriage," he said plainly. No judgment, just the word laid bare. "It won't fix everything. Some'll still talk. But it'd give you legal standing, protection under the law." Mara felt heat rush to her cheeks, not from shame, but from the shock of it. The idea had never truly crossed her mind. Not in a world like this. "Is that even legal?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "For us to marry? In New Mexico territory?" Reed nodded. "There's no law against it. Not yet." He grew solemn. But things are changing. When statehood comes, laws might follow. Prejudice has a way of writing itself into ink. But if you marry now, it'll stand, even if things turn later." Tael hadn't spoken. His eyes were locked on her, unreadable. "I should leave you two to talk this through," Reed said, standing and taking up his hat. "I came to deliver a warning. What you do with it, that's your call." Mara followed him to the door, her mind reeling. But before he stepped out, the captain turned back, his voice low. "There's a minister in Albuquerque, Orrin Bly at the Methodist Church. My wife and I married there. He's a decent man, sees folks for who they are." She met his eyes. "Thank you, Captain, for everything." When the door closed behind him, she turned to face Tael. He hadn't moved an inch from the wall. His silence wrapped around them like smoke. "Marriage," she said softly, tasting the word. "Is that what you want?" His voice came quiet, guarded. "What I want is to be with you. No fear, no hiding." She stepped closer. Close enough to see it. Real fear in his eyes, the kind that came not from danger, but from hope. "If marriage makes that possible." She hesitated, heart pounding. "Unless you don't—" Tael pulled her into his arms. His kiss said what words couldn't. It was desperate, fierce, true. When they broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought," he whispered, "that I'd live to see a day where you could be my wife, not just in spirit, but before the law, before God." "Is that a yes?" she asked, barely breathing. He smiled, that rare smile that lit his whole face. "Yes, if you're sure this is what you want." "I've never been more sure," she said. And she meant it. 2 weeks later, in the warm quiet of a small church in Albuquerque, Mara Ellridge and Tael stood side by side beneath the wooden cross. The ceremony was simple, humble, just Reverend Orrin Bly, his wife Sybil, Captain Reed, and his Navajo wife Loon as witnesses. Mara wore her late mother's dress, taken in and hemmed to fit just right. Tael wore a suit they'd bought with nearly all their savings, his long dark hair tied back, face solemn but proud. They exchanged modest gold rings and even simpler vows. No poetry, no frills, just truth, spoken from the depths of their hearts. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Bly said, his voice full of warmth. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The words echoed like a benediction. In that quiet church, surrounded by so little, they had everything. As Mara Ellridge looked up into Tael's face, her husband's face now, she felt something settle deep inside her chest. A quiet certainty. The world might never understand the bond they'd forged, but they had carved out a space for it anyway. Made it law. Made it sacred. Not just between them, but under the eyes of God and country. "Mrs. Ellridge," Tael whispered, tasting the name like something foreign but precious. Mara grinned and countered, "Mr. Ellridge." She had insisted he take her name, not out of vanity, but strategy. It was a shield, something that might help them slip beneath the judgment of small-minded folks. On the marriage papers, they were Mr. and Mrs. Ellridge, a title that might just hold off a few raised eyebrows, a few wagging tongues. Captain Axton Reed was the first to greet them after the vows, his wife Loon at his side. Loon was striking, dark hair pinned neatly, eyes full of warmth and knowing. She clasped Mara's hands with such genuine ease that Mara immediately felt the stirrings of friendship. "Congratulations," Axton said, shaking Tael's hand firmly. "I've already filed your certificate with the territorial office. It's official." "Thank you," Tael said, with a depth of gratitude in his voice that surprised even himself. "For everything." Loon squeezed Mara's hands gently. "The road you've chosen ain't easy," she said, voice low but strong. "But joy worth having often walks with hardship. Just remember that on the days it feels too heavy." Before they left, Reverend Orrin Bly pulled Mara aside. "I've joined many lives together," he said, correcting himself with a kind smile. "Mrs. Ellridge, but not often have I seen two hearts more clearly meant for one another, even with the whole world trying to stand in the way." "You don't disapprove?" Mara asked, her voice betraying a flicker of worry. The Reverend's weathered eyes crinkled with warmth. "The way I understand God's love, it don't draw lines between race or class. He made every kind of person, and called it good. Who am I to question his work?" His words followed them like a prayer as they journeyed back toward the mountains, tucked deep into Mara's heart for the storms she knew were still ahead. That night, they shared a small hotel room, paid for with the last of their coin. It had 4 walls and a real bed, a luxury they hadn't known for months. As moonlight spilled across the sheets in quiet patterns, Tael reached out, trailing his fingers gently across Mara's bare shoulder. "My wife," he whispered, awe clinging to every syllable. Mara nestled closer, resting her head against him. "My husband." The words tasted like victory, not just against the world, against loneliness, against fear. It was a promise, a stand. They would return not as mistress and laborer, not as woman and hired hand, but as husband and wife, true partners. "Do you think they'll ever accept us?" Mara murmured. "The folks in town?" Tael was quiet for a long while, tracing soft patterns on her skin. "Some won't," he admitted. "Not ever. But some might. In time. Change moves slow, but it moves." "Loon and Captain Reed seem happy," Mara offered. "They found a way." "They did," Tael nodded. "And we're not alone. Others like us are carving out space between the lines." Mara turned to face him, her gaze soft but searching. "Tell me what you want," she said. "For our future." Tael's brow furrowed slightly, thoughtful. "Peace," he said. "A quiet life. Maybe." He hesitated, then smiled gently. "Maybe children. Ones with your smile and my eyes." The image caught Mara off guard, swelling her heart with something raw and new. She'd never pictured herself as a mother. But now, with Tael, the thought didn't scare her. It called to her. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." The journey back up the muddy spring trail took 2 days. The air smelled of thaw and pine. When they crested the ridge, their cabin came into view, nestled among trees just as they'd left it. "Home," Mara breathed, relief in her voice. Tael's arm tightened around her waist. "Our home," he corrected. And it was, not just in spirit, but on paper now, too. In Albuquerque, she had amended the deed to include his name. That land, the mountain, the soil, the cabin, it belonged to both of them now. A layer of protection no sheriff or lawyer could so easily dismiss. By May, spring had taken full hold. The garden expanded, thanks to Tael's handiwork building new raised beds. They worked shoulder to shoulder in the dirt, in sync, moving like they'd been doing this for years. And news of their marriage began to ripple through the territory. As expected, not all who heard were pleased. As Mara Ellridge looked up into Tael's face, her husband's face now, she felt something settle deep inside her chest. Not peace, exactly. Not even triumph. But a fierce, bone-deep knowing. This was right. The world could mutter, scoff, or scorn, but they had bound themselves to each other, in law, in love, and in the eyes of heaven. "Mrs. Tael," he whispered, as if trying the words out on his tongue. It sounded foreign and tender all at once. "Mr. Ellridge," she answered with a soft smile, reminding him, teasing him, of the paperwork they'd signed. It had been her idea, choosing her surname for both of them. Not for pride, but protection. On paper, they were Mr. and Mrs. Ellridge, an extra layer of armor against the prejudice they were bound to face. But to each other, they were simply Mara and Tael. After the ceremony, Captain Axton Reed stepped forward, his wife Loon beside him. She was striking. Dark curls pinned back, eyes like warm whiskey, and a quiet confidence Mara felt drawn to immediately. "Congratulations," Reed said, gripping Tael's hand firmly. "I've gone ahead and filed your marriage certificate with the territorial office. It's done, official, and on record." "Thank you," Tael said with quiet sincerity. "For everything." Loon took Mara's hands, her voice soft but steady. "The road you've chosen ain't an easy one," she said. "But the joy, it's real. Let that carry you through the storms." Just before they left, Reverend Orrin Bly pulled Mara gently aside. "I've joined many hearts in my time, Miss Ellridge. Pardon me, Mrs. Ellridge," he corrected with a kindly smile. "But it's rare I see two people stitched together so strongly, despite what this world throws in their path." "You don't disapprove?" Mara asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He chuckled low. "God's love don't come with borders or bloodlines. He made every kind, called 'em good. Who am I to say otherwise?" His words clung to her like a prayer as they left Albuquerque behind, heading back toward their mountain with the weight of new vows and the promise of harder days ahead. That night, in a shabby little hotel room bought with the last of their coin, Mara and Tael held each other beneath real walls and clean linens, a far cry from the cold dirt floor of their cabin. Moonlight poured in silver through the window. Tael's hand traced her shoulder, slow and reverent. "My wife," he murmured, still tasting the word like it was something rare. Mara smiled against his chest. "My husband." The words weren't just titles. They were a rebellion, a bond, a vow to face the frontier and its fires together. "Do you think folks'll ever accept us?" she asked in a whisper. Tael was quiet a long time. His fingertips drew idle patterns along her skin. "Some never will," he said finally, "but others might, in time. Change comes slow out here, but it comes." "The Reeds seem happy," she offered. "They found a way." "They did," he nodded. "And they ain't the only ones." Mara turned to face him fully. "What do you want? For our future?" He thought a moment, long and hard. "Peace," he said simply. "A quiet life. Maybe children someday. Little ones with your laugh and my eyes." The thought caught Mara off guard. She hadn't pictured motherhood much. It always seemed too distant, too fragile. But now, with Tael, it didn't just feel possible. It felt right. "I'd like that," she whispered, resting her head against him. "More than I ever knew." The trip back up the mountain took 2 days. Spring had softened the path, though the wheels still dragged in patches of thawed mud. As they crested the final hill, their cabin came into view, framed by towering pines and a sky the color of faded denim. "Home," Mara said, her breath catching. "Our home," Tael corrected gently, his arm slipping around her waist. That mattered, not just the word, but the meaning behind it. What once had been hers, the weight of her family's land, the burdens of inheritance, was now theirs. The deed, signed and notarized in Albuquerque, bore both their names. As April faded into May, the land burst into bloom. Their garden stretched wider this year, thanks to Tael's careful construction of new raised beds. They planted side by side, moved in sync, a rhythm forged by love and labor. Word of their marriage traveled fast through the hills and towns. Some scoffed, some sneered, but others Others surprised them. Tamsin Rowe, the widowed storekeeper, had been the first to greet them on their return trip into town. "Took y'all long enough," she said dryly, handing over a sack of flour. "Your father would have smiled at this, Mara." Then there was Halden Pike, the old blacksmith, who'd always treated Mara kindly. He shook Tael's hand without hesitation. "Man ought to stand by his woman," he said with a grunt. "Ain't nobody else's damn business." Small gestures, but they meant the world. Captain Reed kept his word, ensuring that patrols stayed clear of their property. He and Loon became friends, occasional guests who brought news from the fort, stories from afar, and voices that reminded them they weren't alone. "Statehood's coming," Axton said one golden evening on their porch. "Maybe not this year, but soon. Things'll change when it does." "For better or worse?" Mara asked, handing him coffee. He exchanged a look with Loon. "Both," he admitted. "Progress always cuts both ways." Loon's eyes softened. "When I first came to live among Axton's people, I felt like I'd never belong," she said. "But with time, I found those who saw me, not just my skin or name." "And until then?" Mara asked. "You've got each other," Loon said, her smile calm. "And friends who understand your path, 'cause they walk it too." Later that night, while the men talked, the women washed dishes together, and that's when Loon noticed what Mara had only begun to suspect. "How long?" she asked gently. Mara hesitated. "A month, maybe 2. I haven't told Tael yet." Loon's hand squeezed hers. "He'll be thrilled, and scared. The world ain't kind to children caught between 2 worlds, but they also carry strength. 2 bloods, 2 fires. Don't let fear take root too early." That night, as the stars blinked above their mountain, Mara told Tael. He didn't speak at first, just laid his hand gently on her belly. "Our child," he said, voice barely there. "Are you happy?" She asked it, still doubting, still unsure. His reply wasn't words. It was a kiss on her lips, then on her belly. Quiet, devout. That same night he worked late by lamplight, shaping cedar with careful hands. He carved a cradle, marked with signs from his people's stories. "For protection," he whispered, tracing the symbols, "and for belonging." The seasons turned. Autumn came with golden light and morning frost. Mara's body began to change. Her breasts ached, her stomach turned with the rising sun. By the time snow dusted the cabin roof, the truth was no longer a whisper. "A child," she murmured one night, his hand resting gently on the swell of her belly. Their child, their future. Though the snow thickened around their mountain cabin, Tael refused to let Mara lift more than she should. Every time she stepped outside, his eyes were on her. "I'm pregnant, not helpless," she told him with a smirk. He didn't argue, only replied with quiet conviction. "You carry our future. I'd move mountains to keep you safe." The long winter nights became their time to prepare. Tael whittled small toys by the firelight, tiny figures, a horse, a bear, whatever might spark their child's imagination. Meanwhile, Mara stitched together scraps of cloth into baby garments, and a patchwork quilt sewn from her father's worn shirts and her mother's faded dresses. When Tael asked about the quilt's pattern, she said softly, "It's a link to where we come from. Both sides of us." They spent Christmas in the quiet glow of pine-scented air, with a small tree decorated in pine cones and berries. Gifts were humble but heartfelt. A fine new knife from Halden Pike for Tael, and a soft leather-bound journal for Mara, so she could write memories for their child to someday read. With the turn of the year came whispers of unrest. Soldiers passed more frequently down in the valley, and news of skirmishes out west reached their doorstep. Axton Reed made the trip up in February, his coat still dusted with snow when he arrived. "Pressure's mounting in Washington," he told them. "General Brask Hollow's being pushed to show results. Congress wants action after those attacks on settlements." Mara instinctively placed her hand on her belly. "Are we in danger?" Axton's expression tightened. "Not directly. Your marriage offers some protection. I've told my superiors you're settlers, peaceful folks, but tensions are running high. Best be cautious." When spring returned, it brought fresh growth and change. The railroad crept closer, carving into the valley below with noise and new buildings. "It's not all bad," Mara murmured one day as they stood on the ridge, watching the slow creep of civilization. "There's a new doctor in town," she continued. "Delivered Loon's baby just fine last month." Tael wrapped an arm around her, sensing the turn of her thoughts. "You thinking we might need his help too?" "I'm saying we have options," she replied. "Your mother birthed you on this mountain, but we can adapt when it makes sense." When Mara's labor began in late May, early and fast, there was no time to waste. The wagon ride down the muddy trail was brutal, every rut a bolt of pain, but Tael never left her side. "Don't leave me," she gasped through gritted teeth. "Never," he said, gripping her hand. "You have my heart. Always." Dr. Wilson's clinic was small but clean. He faltered only for a moment when Tael refused to leave the room. It was Loon who settled things, arriving just in time. "He stays," she said without hesitation. "That's his wife, his child." Hours passed in grueling pain before a cry broke through the still air, a defiant, mighty sound. "Strong lungs," Dr. Wilson nodded, laying the newborn in Mara's arms. "A boy, healthy." Tael's eyes welled as he stared at his son. Dark hair, skin neither light nor dark, but a perfect mix of both. "Thomas," Mara whispered, voice thick with meaning. Tael nodded. "Thomas Ellridge," he echoed. Then, lowering his voice just for her, added, "In my tongue, he's Little Hawk. His spirit's free." 5 days later, they returned to the mountains with Thomas wrapped tight in soft blankets. The cradle by their bed stood waiting, built with care. Emma had helped sew the last of the bedding in those final months. As summer unfolded, the rhythms of their life changed. Now their days were ruled not by sun or season, but by the needs of a tiny soul. Sleepless nights, quiet days, joy stitched between exhaustion. "He's got your eyes," Mara said one warm afternoon as she nursed him on the porch. Tael smiled, more easily than he used to. "And your fire," he chuckled. "You hear how he demands what he wants?" Their laughter rang across the ridge. It didn't erase the uncertainty the world below still carried. But here, they had carved out something precious, something theirs. Come autumn, Axton Reed would ride up again, and with him, more news from a changing world. The look on Axton Reed's face was grim as he spoke to Mara and Tael, the morning light slicing through their modest cabin like a blade. He had ridden hard up the mountain to deliver troubling news. New legislation was being proposed in Santa Fe. Laws that, if passed, could call into question the very right of their union and the future of their family. "It may never see the governor's desk," Reed said carefully, reading the fear in their eyes. "And even if it does, your marriage is on record, signed, sealed. They can't take that back." "But they can still make life harder," Mara murmured, her gaze drifting toward the porch where little Kyle was sprawled out on a quilt, babbling as he examined a pine cone with the seriousness only a child could muster. Reed gave a small nod. "They'll try. Some folks always do." That night, with Kyle asleep in his cradle, Mara stepped outside and found Tael standing beneath a canopy of stars. their glow scattered across his copper-toned skin like dusted silver. She slipped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "What's on your mind?" she asked. He laced his fingers over hers. "That what we've built here. It's worth protecting. Worth every fight we'll have to face." She could feel the strength in him, not just in body but in soul, steady as the mountain beneath their feet. "Then we fight," she whispered, "as long as it takes." He turned in her arms, his eyes searching hers. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Choosing me? This life?" Mara blinked at the question, surprised by the rare flicker of doubt in him. "Not for a second," she said fiercely. "You and Kyle are the truest things I've ever known." He kissed her, slow and full of the quiet devotion they'd forged together. Not in fairy tales, but in fire, snow, sweat, and tenderness. When they pulled apart, she took his hand and led him back inside. "Whatever the world throws at us," he said, "we meet it the way we always have, one day at a time." They crossed the threshold into the warm cabin, the scent of pine and earth wrapping around them like an old promise. The world outside might shift, might pass laws, whisper rumors, draw lines in the sand. But in this home, love reigned, wild, unbroken, free. The years passed. One summer morning, 5 years later, sunlight danced through the pines and laid shifting shadows across the cabin's clearing. A young boy's laughter rang through the air. Kyle, now 5, was racing a wooden hoop across the yard, his dark eyes shining, the very image of his father's spirit. Trailing behind him was his little sister, Sarah, no more than 2, stubbornly determined to keep up on chubby legs. Her blonde curls shimmered in the sun, her skin kissed with her father's heritage, her chin set with her mother's fire. Mara sat on the porch shelling peas, her eyes following them with quiet joy. Her face had changed, etched deeper by wind and time, but her spirit had only grown brighter. Every wrinkle had been earned, and every day was still a gift. "Mama, look," Kyle shouted. "I can make it roll all the way to the barn." "I see you, sweetheart," she called back with a smile. "Mind your sister." Kale slowed, dutiful as ever, letting Sarah catch up. Mara's heart swelled with gratitude. Her children were healthy, kind, strong. This life, hard-won and fiercely protected, had grown roots deeper than fear. New Mexico had become a state 3 years earlier. With that came change. Some laws had passed, aiming to silence families like theirs, but their marriage remained valid. Their children were recognized. The documents filed in Albuquerque had held firm against the tide. The town below had grown, too. The railroad brought strangers, and with them came both danger and hope. Some folks turned their backs, but others opened doors. Tamsin Rowe had been the first, defending the Ellridge family like a lioness when gossip stirred. Ms. Gardiner, the new schoolteacher, had welcomed Cale with open arms that winter. Dr. Wilson had delivered both Cale and Sarah, and treated them all with quiet dignity. Even Dara Holt, once cold and suspicious, had softened into something resembling tolerance. Corvin Strake, however, remained the same. Envious, sly, still sending offers laced with threats, still hungry for their land. But his power was slipping. Thanks to a reservoir built further west, his thirst for water rights no longer gave him leverage. "Riders comin'!" Kyle shouted suddenly, shielding his eyes against the sun. His vision, sharp like his father's, had always been uncanny. Mara stood quickly, spotting 2 figures weaving their way up the trail. "It's Papa and Uncle Garrick," Kyle beamed, bolting towards the path. "Papa!" Sarah squealed behind him, toddling as fast as she could. Toel had been gone 3 days, riding with Major Reed, and now, as Mara stepped down from the porch into the yard, sunlight catching her hair, heart racing. She felt it again. That same old fire rising. Love, defiant and unshakable, waiting at the gate. As Mara Ellridge looked into Tael's face, her husband now, she felt a deep, bone-settling peace, like a river finally finding its course. The world might never understand what they'd found in each other, but that didn't matter. They had chosen this path, signed it in ink, sealed it in spirit. Before man and God alike, it was real. Mrs. Tael, he whispered, the name tasting unfamiliar on his tongue, strange but sacred. Mr. Ellridge, she teased back with a smile, reminding him gently of the agreement. They would both carry her name. It was safer that way, less for folks to question or scorn. On paper they were Mr. and Mrs. Ellridge, a small shield against the harsh glares and whispered judgments they both knew would come. Captain Axton Reed stepped forward after the ceremony, his wife Loon beside him. Loon had a warmth to her, steady eyes, easy smile, that put Mara at ease instantly. "Congratulations," the captain said, clasping Tael's hand firmly. "I filed the certificate myself with the territorial office. It's official, recognized and recorded." "Thank you," Tael replied, sincere in tone. "For everything." Loon gently squeezed Mara's hands. "The road ahead won't be easy," she said softly. "But the joy you've found, hold on to it, especially on the hard days." As they were preparing to leave, Reverend Orrin Bly took Mara aside, his voice low and kind. "I've performed many unions in my time, Miss Ellridge. Pardon me, Mrs. Ellridge," he said with a knowing smile. "But few have stirred my spirit like yours. It's clear you two were meant to walk this life together. You don't disapprove?" she asked quietly. "Some might call what you've done wrong," he said, eyes soft with conviction. "But I believe God made all peoples and called them good. His love doesn't care for color or bloodline, and neither should we." His words stayed with her long after they left Albuquerque. A comfort, a shield for the road ahead. That night, in a modest hotel room paid for with the last of their savings, Mara and Tael finally celebrated their marriage with walls around them, a real bed beneath them. Luxuries their mountain cabin could never offer. Later, moonlight spilled in silver ribbons across the sheets. Tael's fingers traced the slope of her shoulder like he was memorizing her all over again. "My wife," he murmured, still tasting wonder. Mara smiled, curling closer. "My husband." The words didn't just feel sweet. They felt earned, a defiance, a vow. Whatever came next, they'd face it side by side, not as mistress and hired man, but as true partners in every sense. "You think they'll ever accept us?" she asked in a hush. "The folks in town?" Tael didn't answer right away. His hand moved in slow, thoughtful circles on her back. "Some never will," he said finally. "But others might, in time. Change is slow, but it does come. Captain Reed and Loon look happy," Mara said. "They found a way." "They did," he nodded. "And there are others too, living between worlds like us, finding a place to belong." Mara turned to face him. "What do you want, for us, for the future?" He grew thoughtful. "Peace," he said at last. "A quiet life. And maybe—" He hesitated. "Maybe children, with your smile and my eyes." The image filled her with a longing she hadn't known she carried. She'd never thought of herself as a mother. Not before him. "I'd like that," she whispered, resting her head against his chest. "Very much." It took them 2 days to make it home. The spring thaw had left the trail slick and heavy. But when they crested that final ridge, the cabin came into view, tucked quiet among the tall pines. "Home," Mara breathed, tension melting from her shoulders. Tael tightened his arm around her waist on the wagon seat. "Our home," he corrected gently. The words landed deep. The deed she'd changed in Albuquerque now bore both their names, a shield of ink and law against any who'd try to take it from them. April turned to May, and spring bloomed in earnest. Mara expanded the garden. Tael built new raised beds for vegetables. They worked shoulder to shoulder, the rhythm of their days both familiar and wholly new. News of their marriage spread fast, as news tends to do, and reactions, well, they came just as quickly. Later that summer, Tael rode out on a mission to a nearby Apache village. Some young men had wandered from the reservation, and fort officers were uneasy. Axton Reed had asked Tael to mediate, knowing his voice could bridge the divide between the two worlds better than any uniform ever could. When he returned, Mara watched from the cabin steps as he swung down from his horse, scooping both children into his arms with practiced ease. The years had etched silver into his hair, creases around his eyes, but his strength hadn't faded, nor the quiet nobility that first stole her heart. "Went well?" she asked, as Thomas rode proudly on his father's shoulders. Tael nodded. "They're heading back. Just a misunderstanding?" Reed dismounted slower, his old leg injury acting up again in the heat. "Your husband saved us a real mess," the major said, taking a swig from the canteen Mara handed him. "If the army had more men like him, we'd have half the troubles." "The army's not ready for men like him," Mara replied with a half-smile. They all knew it was the truth. They shared a meal on the porch, talking of town news and fort rumors. Loon and their son would arrive the next day for their monthly visit, something they'd kept up for years, no matter how busy the major got. After Reed left, Mara and Tael settled into their nightly routine. Thomas helped his father with the livestock, while Mara bathed little Sarah and tucked her into bed. Later they sat on the porch, watching stars prick through the night sky. "I missed you," Mara said, leaning into his warmth. "The children did too." Tael's arm wrapped tighter. "I thought of you every moment," he said, quiet and true. Then, after a pause, "Those boys at the village, they felt caught between worlds, belonging nowhere. You're worried about Thomas and Sarah," she said gently. "Sometimes," he admitted, "the world can be cruel to those who don't fit." "It can also be kind," she reminded him. "They've got us, this place, and each other, long after we're gone." He nodded slowly. "And something I never had, pride in both sides of who they are." They fell into a peaceful hush, the mountain wrapped in twilight. From inside came the soft sounds of their children sleeping, Thomas muttering in a dream, Sarah's soft breaths. "Would you change anything?" Tael asked suddenly. "Go back, to that day we crossed the line from employer and—" "No," Mara said, firm and quick. "Not a single moment. Every step brought us here." She turned to him, starlight touching her face. "Would you?" His answer came without words, in the gentle way he kissed her, in the hands that still held her like she was the only truth that ever mattered. Later, in their bedroom, with their children safe nearby, they came together once more. Not for passion's sake, but to honor the journey that had defied every force set to tear them apart. She never again spoke of the night she once tried to push him away. Because now, when Tael said, "I can't stop thinking about you," Mara just smiled and answered, "Then don't." Because love, real love, doesn't ask permission. It doesn't bend to rules or fear. It just is. And it's always worth the price. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Some journeys shape us, and we hope this one left a mark on your heart. There are more paths ahead, more legends of love, hardship, and redemption beneath the western sky. Please subscribe, leave your thoughts, and travel with us once again. Thank you, and God bless. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. The stories presented here are creative expressions and may mix historical inspiration with dramatized scenes. AI tools contribute to some elements of voice, imagery, and structure, but every published story is refined by editors and creators to ensure authentic emotional impact. We honor YouTube's policies and do not generate deceptive likenesses or artificial depictions of real people. All audiovisual components are legally licensed. Any use, redistribution, or alteration of this content must be granted through written consent. Your presence here means a lot. Thank you for supporting artistic storytelling.